Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fan fiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and Accio headphones, and let the magic begin. Chapter 16 of Greenlight by SereneMusafir. Chapter 16. The world will condemn us for the choices we will make, but for you I will happily drink this nectar and be damned. Sophia Al-Jabbar, 1915. Footsteps thunder as Hermione runs, eyes fixated on the dragon flying ahead. Her heart thumps in her ribcage like a panicked fluttering of a bird. Close behind, Malfoy follows. The fact that he hasn't called after her to stop or even question what she's doing has her wondering in the back of her mind how far she can go with him without resistance. Not that she knows what she's doing either, running after a dragon that she very well cannot catch up with. All she knows is that there are dragons here, and she needs to know why. Together, they weave through the streets, further away from town, and the crowds there and out into the outskirts. The paths are narrowed here, and Hermione has to change the direction several times when they stumble into a dead end. At one point, she loses track of the dragon and she pauses, unsure where to go and questioning for a second why she's chasing after the creatures in the first place. But then the ground trembles and the air explodes once more as another dragon, this one smaller, soars above. And then she's running once more, blindly, through the alleys, ducking past open doors and fruit-filled carts. The dragon leads them into an open field. Hermione and Malfoy skid to a stop where 5 dragons rest further near an encampment. "What is this?" Hermione wheezes, crouching to her knees as she struggles to catch her breath. "It's like a sanctuary," Malfoy says, coming from behind her and pointing at a sign near one of the larger tents. A single bead of sweat against his temple is the only note of discomfort on his face from the run. "The North African Dragon Sanctuary," he translates, squinting at the scrawled Arabic. They drew closer to the edge of the base where a group of wizards surrounded a smaller dragon that Hermione recognizes as the second they spotted in the air. A man mounts off the dragon, landing with a thud on the ground, scattering dust. He takes off his hood and runs his hands through his red shoulder-length hair, and for a second Hermione panics, thinking it's Charlie. Her mind whirs into motion, trying to come up with some kind of explanation, but when he turns around fully, she realizes it's someone else, and she tries not to focus on the immense relief she feels. The rider walks over, nodding at them and greeting. When he gets closer, he shouts, "Did the dragons draw you out? We were in town and saw them." Hermione explains, straightening. She can't believe there are actual living dragons here. Wizards in light robes buzz around the encampment, shouting orders as they work around the beast. Malfoy hesitates, choosing to hover behind while Hermione gets closer to watch the scene unfold with the dragon the man just dismounted. They often do bring the stragglers out. The rest of the town is used to the dragons flying through, but we almost always have some unexpected travelers coming in to see what is happening. The beast lets out a deep snort, snout digging into its wings, as 3 younger wizards come with ropes. 2 of the wizards wave their wand around the dragon's wings to gently rope him in, while the other brings out a pail of what looks like raw meat. When the 2 with ropes tug to get the dragon to move, it resists with dramatic expressions that indicates it's not moving until another piece of meat is thrown its way. 2 pieces of meat vanquish until the dragon finally deems to follow them. "My name is Zahim," the rider yells, turning back around to Hermione and Malfoy. He catches Malfoy's grimace, and he gives him a sheepish smile, lowering his voice significantly to say, "Sorry, I always forget that things are a lot quiet on the ground. A bad habit of mine. What brings you here?" "We're passing through to get to the desert," Malfoy answers, reaching out to shake Zahim's hand. "What do you do with the dragons?" "This batch of dragons was brought in this morning from the Algerian borders," Zahim explains. He motions at Malfoy and Hermione to follow him closer to the dragons. "We're hoping to rehabilitate the dragons before sending them off to the desert again in a few days." "What happened to them?" Hermione asks, eyeing 2 of the larger slouched dragons. Both of them shiver and huddle closer together despite the warm temperature. Their tails curve around their large bodies, wounding them into smaller sizes. The dragons blink slowly in their direction, their dull eyes lidded with disinterest before turning away with heavy heads. Even from afar, and with her limited experience with dragons, she can gauge there's something off with their behavior. "Victims of Spanish poaching, unfortunately," Zahim says grimly. "The male, Saharian fireback, has been in recent years targeted for their husks, and then left behind for dead." The husks, when ground to pulp, leave behind a liquid of addictive properties. These dragons here are the mates of the ones who have died. We found them in Algeria, where the sister sanctuary of the NADS exists to rehabilitate the dragons there. Once they're deemed able to fly once more, we bring them to a region closest to where they are naturally found. This group of dragons that we've brought in originate from the Moroccan region of the Sahara Desert. Her heart aches as she looks into the dark pools of the dragon that grunts her way and then shifts to hide her snout under her wing as if taken aback by the sound leaving its massive body. They just look so hopeless, Hermione whispers. Zahim nods, eyeing the dragons. They mate for life such that when one partner dies, the other falls into a level of despair where they simply cannot fly. The sadness at the death of the mate they feel can be terminal, leaving them unable to eat, move, or do anything else vital to their life. Eventually, their bodies may atrophy to a point where rehabilitation is no longer an option. It's been the mission of the NADS to bring the female dragons back to a steady, sentient state. We teach them how to fly, how to feel the wind again, so they may have hope to live, even if they cannot do so without their mates. In the end, that's all we can ask of them. How many have you rehabilitated? Malfoy asks. Hermione's eyes flicker over to the two disconsolate dragons until they snag to one a little further away from the rest. Less than a dozen, sadly, and just a fraction of the ones we've taken in over the years originates from Morocco. The 5 we brought with us yesterday were thought to be ready after 16 months of rehabilitation, but as you can see, these 2 right here have fallen back into the dejection that we found them in. On the other hand, the dragon you saw me come in on, Arya, is ready to be sent out tomorrow. I could just feel the shift in her on today's flight. Malfoy asks another question, but Hermione finds herself drifting to the 3rd dragon that's caught her eye. This dragon, much smaller than the one she's seen thus far, watches Hermione come closer, dark, beady eyes following her every hesitant move. She blinks lazily, but the sharpness that the other 2 dragons lack sparks brightly when Hermione takes a step toward her. Hello, Hermione murmurs softly. The dragon tilts her head quizzically at Hermione's voice, blowing a soft huff through her nose. This close, Hermione can admire the dragon's black hide. Soft leather, despite the worn increases with splatters of pale gray that give the illusion of a midnight sky. Muted orange scales, varied in different shades and marred by scars, scatter across its back, giving an ode to its name. Hermione steps closer, once more knowing perhaps she's pushing a boundary but feeling an inclination nevertheless. She raises a slow hand, pausing halfway when the dragon's forked tail thumps once loudly. Her pulse quickens and a chill like an ice cube drips down her back, but her hand doesn't back down. My name is Hermione, she whispers, trying to slow her shaky breath to not make an extra noise or movements that could scare her. The dragon blinks and brings its head close toward her hand, near enough that if she goes on her toes, the tip of Hermione's fingers can touch the end of the snout. Acutely, she's aware of the footsteps coming and stopping behind her. I'm sorry, Hermione says thickly, stomach twisting painfully when she remembers Zahim told her about mates being left behind for what you've lost. Perhaps the dragon understood what she said, or perhaps she simply hears the genuine sorrow in Hermione's voice for the unadulterated greed in the world that doesn't seem to learn, because it lets out a single painful guttural sound resonating from the pit of its stomach, and then with another huff, and without a moment for Hermione to spare or understand what was happening, the dragon lowers her head under Hermione's extended hand. There's a sharp gasp behind her, but Hermione doesn't dare move. She doesn't even breathe. She's utterly transfixed by the surprising warmth radiating beneath the dragon's thick hide and the steady weight of the snout cupped in her hands, and when the dragon doesn't make any other moves, Hermione excels. Brilliant, Zahim breathes in awe, coming up to stand beside Hermione. Absolutely brilliant. What's her name? Layla, for the very knight she is. He replies, I must say how rare it is for her to trust you like this. In fact, all of these dragons are distrustful enough towards most humans that only a select few are ever allowed to take them on a flight. Layla has allowed only one other person to touch her, and that is me. And believe me, it was not after a few minutes either. Hermione slides her hand from underneath the snout to rest on the pointed ridges lining the top. Layla closes her eyes. She's beautiful. Hermione glances around, searching for Malfoy. When she doesn't find him beside her, she looks over her shoulder. Malfoy stands further behind, far away from the dragon's reach, palming his wand. His gaze is fixed on Hermione's hand, eyes narrowed on the dragon, as if suspecting the next move. Malfoy, she calls. She takes in his tense frame. His eyes reluctantly move away from the dragon. Don't you want to come and see her? He shakes his head vehemently. I'm fine right here. Actually, I think we should leave, Granger. You wanted oranges, right? We should go before the markets close. Malfoy, Hermione chides lightly. You can't be afraid of dragons. That's cosmically not allowed. I'm not afraid, he shoots her a glare, which is interrupted by a jolt, a slight tremor in his shoulders that Hermione catches right away when Layla grunts under Hermione's hands. His eyes widen in a mere fraction and his grip on his wand tightens. Hermione bites the inside of her cheeks to stop herself from laughing. I promise she won't hurt you. She glances at Zahim. Layla won't hurt him, will she? It's hard to know, Zahim says contemplatively, catching Hermione's teasing glint. She's quite taken by you, so perhaps if you stay close by to just make sure, Layla may not attack. In my experience, there have been only a handful of attacks against men. But, of course, if you're near, he should be quite all right. Hermione hums in agreement. I think I can manage to sort something out if anything happens. This isn't my first time, with a dragon. In my humble opinion, dragons and I have a special connection, quite dated. How many times have you been acquainted with a dragon, Malfoy? For fuck's sake, Malfoy grumbles, stalking over. He glares at her again, but he wavers ever so slightly when he steps beside Hermione that there's no malice behind it. Layla growls, eyes narrowing at Malfoy with clear distrust. Immediately, Malfoy jerks back, darting a look toward Hermione that says, see? Like this, Hermione reaches for his hand when she knows he won't make the move himself. His eyes fall onto their joined fingers, lingering there for a moment before flicking back up to her. When he realizes what she's planning to do, he tries to let go immediately. But Hermione holds on, gripping his fingers tightly between hers. Granger, what? Trust me, she whispers, low enough for just him to hear. He stares, and she hopes he can see the weight of the words that she is trying to communicate. See that she doesn't take this lightly, this request, that is perhaps harder for him to accept than anything else she might ever ask of him. She thinks maybe he's stopped breathing if the complete rigidity of his body means anything, or maybe he's just preparing to push her aside any second, damn his trust in the dragon, and flee. But she keeps his gaze and waits for him to make a decision, lessening her grip on him in case he wants to let go completely. A few seconds pass and then Malfoy swallows audibly and dips his head. A slight incline of his head meant just for her to see. He exhales a short breath and she physically feels some of the initial panic in him dissipate. He stops resisting. Hermione shifts her hand, letting go of his fingers so that her palm rests on the back of his hand. She squeezes his hand once to ready him and then guides their hands together toward Layla's snout. A deep snarl escapes the dragon's mouth and Malfoy stiffens under her hand. Hermione pauses midway, both of the arms extended, and waits. Layla doesn't shift away from Malfoy, her liquid eyes narrowed down further into slits. But the growl turns into a low rumble when Hermione's other hand gingerly comes up to touch her on the other side. His name is Draco. Malfoy's eyes snap to lock with Hermione with such speed she feels them seared to the side of her face. But she doesn't look away from Layla. The great beast turns her head in Hermione's direction. His name feels strange on her tongue, unfamiliar syllables dripping and staggering in an unsure rhythm before escaping her lips. Unfamiliar out loud now, she thinks, but never before in her mind. He won't hurt you, and it's the easiest thing for her to say. Layla's eyes widen into their original animated orbs. She grunts and slowly lowers her head under Malfoy's hand. Hermione casts a sidelong glance at Malfoy, who looks like he might be sick, but with great resolve chooses instead to let go of a loose breath. All right, Malfoy, she whispers after several seconds when it seems Layla might not snap at him. He nods, a brisk jerk of his head as if he's afraid any sharp movements may scare the dragon. Hermione eases Malfoy's hand down to the peak of Layla's snout and gently withdraws her hand to give him control. Has she gone on her flight for the day? Hermione asks Zahim. She can't help but smile when Malfoy takes a hesitant step closer and Layla's tail comes around to curl against his legs. We'll be taking her soon. Tomorrow is her last flight, and the day after we will release her into the wild. Even though they're supposed to be leaving tonight anyway, Hermione's chest feels heavy at the short time they've been allowed with the dragons. Oh, I see. Hermione runs her hand down Layla's long neck, and without looking at Malfoy, she says, Should we leave, Malfoy? Amina and the rest must be looking for us. Malfoy doesn't reply, though. She feels him watching her. When he does speak to Zahim, they interact in Arabic for several moments before Hermione tries to follow along, eyes jumping between the two from where she stands beside Layla. Zahim laughs and Malfoy repeats what sounds like a question in a firmer voice, and she sees the shift in his stance, head angled, hands casually placed in his pockets as he talks. He looks irresistible, at ease or in character, as though he's donned a comfortable, familiar robe, and he knows exactly what to say or what to do to get his way. What is it? Hermione walks over to them, her hand still resting on Layla. Malfoy, English. Your friend here is asking what it'll take for me to allow you to go on Layla's flight, Zahim explains, amusement lining his eyes. Hermione glances at Malfoy, puzzled, but he refuses to look at her. I ensured that there was no need to offer sums. If you'd like, you may go on the trip. He then asked if it was safe, and I had to assure him thrice that it is. Layla knows the way and will be able to bring you back. Hermione gasps, her heart leaping at the idea. But will that be okay for her? I don't see any issues. The Saharian fireback has excellent memory and great tracking skills. After memorizing yesterday's flight, she will be able to bring you around and then back here. Judging from her current state with you, I can say with certainty there should be no problems with the flight. Her answer is an immediate yes. She turns to Malfoy with a question in her eyes. His brows rise, taken aback. Fuck no. Malfoy, Granger, no fucking way. Malfoy, you have to come. It'll be so easy and fun. You can't even ride a broom. How do you expect riding a dragon will be easy? He's right. Hermione is terrified of riding brooms, which is one reason why she's not keen on Quidditch. It's not surprising that Malfoy knows this. She'd embarrassed herself well enough during their flying lessons at Hogwarts that her natural aversion became quite obvious to everyone. But this is different. She feels it in her bones with the same level of certainty that she knows she won't do it without him. I have experience with dragons before, she sniffs. It's nothing like a broom. Yes, it's fucking alive and can very much rear you off at any point. Layla wouldn't do that, Zahim interjects helpfully. See, Layla wouldn't do that. Malfoy, I want you to come. What are you scared of? I'm not falling for that, Granger. Fine. But don't you like riding brooms? I thought you loved Quidditch. Again, there's a lot more control with brooms that there isn't with dragons. You can go and I'll stay here. Okay, then we both won't go. Don't be stubborn, he says, exasperated. This has nothing to do with me. Just go. It won't be the same. Same? How do you know? This is it, Malfoy, she interrupts, looking at him evenly. You said that right. There's nothing more, nothing less. This is all we have. I won't do it without you. Malfoy looks as though he regrets ever saying anything to her. His tongue pokes out in his cheek, and she keeps eye contact, challenging him to defy his own words. Unspoken words bounce between them as Hermione narrows her eyes and Malfoy lifts his chin. Zahim hesitantly watches the two. Should I count 2 or just the 1 for the ride? Hermione waits. Malfoy sets his jaw. Then, with a curse under his breath, he says, 2. Just make sure to hold on to the straps at all times, Zahim explains as Hermione hoists herself onto the saddle. Malfoy follows right behind her, swinging his leg to the other side and edging far from where she sits. She'll bring you right back. It shouldn't take too long. Any other tips? Hermione asks, pulling her hair together at the nape of her neck. She secures her bag and double-checks it's knotted tight. Her heart hasn't returned to its regular beat since the saddle was brought out, and her stomach lurches and jumps as adrenaline swarms her veins. Zahim grins. Don't fall. Layla takes a step forward, her tail shaking as she tries to stabilize herself on her hind legs. The movements make them unsteady, and Hermione has to grip the leather straps to regain balance. Malfoy's voice is tense as he speaks through clenched teeth. This is mad, Granger. I know. Her arms shake under the intensity of her hold, and she can't imagine the grip required once they're in the air. I know. Ready? Zahim calls, falling far behind other wizards to get out of the way. How many times have you been on a dragon? Malfoy asks, his voice closer now. In the next excel, wings fold open, spanning wide on either side. Layla bucks slightly and lets out a low bellow. Once, Hermione breathes. What? He exclaims. Once? Granger, what the fuck? Layla shoots into the sky. Hermione immediately slides back on the saddle, her thighs clenching uselessly, and into Malfoy's chest. He grunts at the impact, and she tries to apologize, but her words are stolen by the wind. His arms reflexively wrap around her waist, and she thinks maybe he's shouting something, but Layla lets out a loud cry that makes her bones rattle, and then his words disappear too. As Layla continues to ascend into the sky, Hermione dares to peek down below. She makes out Zahim and the other dragons, and when Layla increases speed, Hermione gains a greater scope of the entire town, surrounded by terrains of trees. crowds they pass become tiny little ant colonies until they too become too difficult to see. "If I die, Granger," Malfoy grits out in her ear. "I'm dying with you, Malfoy," she finishes, shouting over the wind. She's unsure whether she's managed to say it loud enough. "Just hold on, okay?" He must have heard her because Malfoy's arms tighten around her shoulders. Malfoy's hands wind around her arms to grip the leather straps in her hands, and Hermione locks her body against the steady, firm plane of his. Without warning, Layla changes her upright course. The world slants and tilts as she curves against the wind and drops. Hermione's stomach plummets as they fall down, down, down. The world becomes a blur. Trees and rocks disintegrate into singular color as they hurtle into the darkness. She tries to lean into the movement, but the speed at which Layla flies prevents her body from doing anything other than tremble. Someone's shrieking, or maybe it's just the wind thrashing in her ear. Either way, there are no thoughts in Hermione's head other than, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die." When it looks like Layla isn't going to turn around from the jagged rocks, Malfoy uselessly yanks on the straps to get her to swerve away from apparent death. But there's little give in the straps, and Hermione squeezes her eyes shut, a scream lodged in her throat as Malfoy curses loudly. Right when she thinks the end is coming, in a swift motion, Layla rotates and slants upward, wings booming, till finally she soars in a single plane. The speed mercifully lowers, and Hermione can finally let out a breath she's been holding. The town disappears behind, and Layla soars over treetops, scattering flocks of birds that rise up and fly beside them before dispersing away. Malfoy's arms remain tight, clutching her stomach for dear life, but she doesn't mind. She's too struck, too in awe by what she sees. Hermione leans to the side, peering down as they pass over two cars. A figure too small to decipher waves at them, and soon the trees vanish too, and they're arching over snow-peaked mountaintops. The air is cooler here, the sun blinding, and when Hermione exhales, she sees her breath in front of her. Layla tilts between the labyrinth of neighboring snow peaks, and her tuck legs brush against patches of snow, leaving behind fragments of frost. Malfoy is a heavy weight behind her. The only confirmation she has is that he's doing okay. She hopes his eyes are open because when the mountains and jagged rocks open to an indigo ocean, Hermione loses all breath. The world stops for her, even when Layla drops once more. Up in the front, the ocean meets the never-ending sky. Down below, the water stirs with the drift from Layla's wings, a serrated roar of water mingling with the screeches of the wind. They sail close to the surface, and Layla's claws withdraw to grasp hold of the water. She hovers just close enough that if they wanted to touch the water too, they could. Malfoy must realize this because he lets go of Hermione with one arm, keeping his other arm securely around her body, and reaches out to the water soaring beneath them. His fingers graze across the surface and droplets rush along his arm, staining his shirt. He risks a glance at her, and if she wasn't already so astonished by everything, the look in his eyes and the bright grin that slowly etches on his face would have been enough to leave her speechless. When Layla rights herself, Malfoy moves back behind her. Rather than curling himself around her once more, he reaches for her hands and slowly stretches out her arms. She gasps, yanking him back to her. But he resists and waits. She turns her head over her shoulder, lifting her eyes to meet his. "Trust me," he mouths. Or maybe he yells it. "Trust me. Trust Malfoy." It's not as difficult a decision for her as he might expect it to be. Hermione nods. Malfoy keeps her gaze as he slowly, muscle by muscle, stretches both of their arms out. Their arms slightly waver against the strong, rapid wind currents. His hands travel from her wrist to rest behind hers. Their fingers intertwine. Her hands, already in the firm hold in his, only tighten further to a near painful grip, and she doesn't care about this either. Malfoy's eyes dip to her lips before lifting to her eyes, heart in her throat and chest heaving with each rapid breath she inhales. Hermione stares at him for a second more before turning back to the front. Together as one, the three of them lift and fall as they soar, and Hermione could cry at the strange feeling unfurling in her chest and blooming across her body, leaving welcome shivers and goosebumps in its wake. She thinks of how this might be for Layla. Learning to fly, an inclination as natural as breathing or sleeping, after devastating loss as losing your mate. Learning to live once more when you've lost all reason to, and Hermione understands. She gets it to her core, and it's the realization of it that could make her weep. Instead, when Layla lets out another victory cry, Hermione tips her head back, and she does the same. When Layla lands back at the sanctuary, Hermione and Malfoy remain on the dragon, unwilling to move. They sit in the aftermath, quiet and struggling to grapple with what's just happened. Finally, as the Heme and the other wizard rush forward, Malfoy shifts to remove his arms from around Hermione and jumps off. Malfoy shakes his head in disbelief and tries again. That was... Hermione, feeling dazed and disoriented, watches complete awe take over his eyes. I know, she whispers, meeting his eyes. Malfoy studies her, and a faint line forms between his brows. He looks like he might try to say something more, but instead exhales and lifts his arms toward her to help her off. Hermione wants to say something more as well, feels the need to commemorate what they both just experienced. But nausea suddenly builds in her chest and bile burns the back of her throat. A familiar feeling she'd often get from apparitions churns her stomach. Layla had spun them before landing, and Hermione's brain had ended up rattling against her skull, and she knows she's going to suffer for it now. Far away, she thinks maybe Amina is calling them, but even that could be a hallucination in her mind. Palms sweaty and a mouth full of saliva, Hermione twists away from Malfoy and jumps to his side rather than his waiting arms. She feels the blood drain from her face, and she raises weak hands to wipe the curls away from her face. Malfoy frowns. Granger? There you guys are, Amina calls, her footsteps clanging against Hermione's skull like a hammer. We've been waiting for you. Imagine our surprise when I saw you and Hermione on a freaking dragon. Amina, Hermione groans and turns just in time away from the two to vomit. Fucking hell, Malfoy mutters. Warm hands slide across her clammy neck as she retches, and her eyes closed at the comforting sensation. She feels the length of hair that's undoubtedly come undone from the flight, pulled away from her skin as she bends over again. Amina toes away from the mess and is beside her. Nice to meet you too, she teases. Hermione waves her wand and the sick vanishes. Amina waves a bottle in front of her and she gratefully chugs it. We should probably go home, Malfoy says from near the back of her neck. Amina helps her up and Malfoy lets go of her hair, stepping back. Wait, the oranges, Hermione moans, grimacing at the sour taste left behind her mouth. I'll buy you a damn orchard, Granger, Malfoy says impatiently. You need to go home. Too exhausted to argue, Hermione gives Layla a parting glance and lets Amina take her into the waiting car. At home, she stumbles into her room and dizzyingly collapses into her bed. Hours later, she's woken by Amina, and together they pack her things. Her mind, now much clearer than before, stalls as she watches the organized chaos of everyone packing tents and loading pieces of luggage. Dusk is creeping through the light of the day, and the wind is as cool as the night they first arrived here. There's a growing lump in her throat as Hermione realizes how much this place has nestled into her heart. Though they were here for mere days, the vastness of each moment has changed her exponentially. It has to end, she thinks. Get down the path in the trees that leads to the cliff. All of this will eventually have to end. Once the last bit of luggage is stored, Hermione follows Lena into the car. She's about to shut the door when Amina cuts in, placing a bag on her lap. Hermione peers in and gasps, hands digging into the dozen bright oranges glaring back at her. She looks up at Amina with a grin, a thank you on her lips, but Amina shakes her head. Not me, she tells her, and Hermione frowns, not understanding. Amina gives her a gentle, knowing smile before leaving. It takes a few seconds for her mind to catch up, but then her head is buzzing with questions. Why? She wants to ask. Why? It's incomprehensible, but nothing that has been happening between her and Malfoy makes sense, or has any explicable reason behind it. Her mind can whir out questions, and perhaps only half of them would have answers, even less that Malfoy can give her directly. Stunned, she's unable to say or do anything but turn back in her seat and hold the oranges in her lap as though they might hold the secrets to divine fortunes. When the cars one by one draw out and into the forest, the trees rustle with branches, waving the ocean's hums farewell, a familiar hymn, and Hermione pulls apart an orange slice. The ride to the desert is long and takes up most of the night. The growing darkness of the night outside makes it difficult to make out the changes of scenery as they pull out of town. They decide not to take a break, and Hermione falls asleep for most of the drive, her head on Lena's shoulders. By 1 a.m, they are well into the desert, and the crew pulls aside to camp for the night. In the dark, it is difficult to make out much of the desert except for the looming shadows of sand dunes. Though the moon shines enough light that they can make out the figures in front of them, a chill encompasses the camp, and the fire is burnt temporarily for warmth as everyone prepares to settle in for the remainder of the night. Exhausted and eyes heavy with sleep, Hermione robotically helps the others set up their tents. When it's her turn, she's so utterly drained that Amina and Lena take over for her. After an hour, the fire has dimmed down and the voices turn into hushed murmurs. With nothing left to help with, Hermione turns to enter her tent when Lena comes up from behind her, taking her by her shoulders. "Look," she whispers. Hermione does, and she gasps at what she sees. The entire blackness of the night sky is saturated with specks of crystal stars that stretch into infinity. Undiluted, winking, and gleaming stars hang in the sky between the pale quarter moon like guiding lanterns. Wide awake now, she doesn't know where to look or what to fixate on. Immediately, Hermione finds herself searching around the encampment. Malfoy's eyes fall from the sky and lock with hers the moment she finds him. The fire between them roars as a cool breeze weaves through the tents, casting dancing shadows across his face. His frigid eyes are ablaze in the fire, and Malfoy doesn't look away either. Hermione's heart sings and grows roots and vines, and she can't help but smile at him. She catches the exact moment that his face shatters into a look of complete dismay. With parted lips and straightened shoulders, his eyes widen as though he's been struck, and he blinks several times as he tries and fails to make sense of what he sees. Hermione's smile grows as she lifts her eyes back to the sky above. She thinks of how one day the moon will eventually drift away into oblivion, the fires and the hurricanes will ravage the world, and at the end of the world, Hermione will be far away from Malfoy, frozen to her soul. She thinks also how 70 years from now, when Hermione lies in her bed, old and lost for memories, forgotten as others once were forgotten, it'll be okay. Everything will be okay, because she'll have this one moment. This moment amongst all other lost and found moments with Malfoy. Here, miles away from home, a full heart under a canopy of stars. It's like walking through a familiar door and stepping into a completely different planet. Hermione had thought she had seen everything by now. The oceans, the dragons, the mountain nestled between the forest. Nothing would have prepared her for the desert. Sand dunes the size of mountains ebb and flow in the desert's dry breeze as the midday sun, a blazing golden orb, rests amongst clear skies. But even under the simplicity of the wind-blown land, Hermione can feel the murmurs of life that once was and might just be found again if they're on the right track. The crew gathers around in the tent to chart the rest of their course and to come up with a plan now that there are just 2 weeks left on this trip. Hermione spent the entire morning in her tent, poring over Sophia's diary. As suspected, there were no mentions of any lights in the sky in the diary. Hermione tells the group what they learned from Hakim and the books they brought from the bookstore. She plans to dig into them today and try to decode the runes from Sophia's diary. She also tells Amina about the lights in the sky they were warned of, and Amina shrugs. "I've heard of them," she says, rolling out the crease in the map. "My great-aunt used to tell us stories about the desert. The lights have come up very briefly, but I've never thought of them as anything other than just that. I don't even think my great-aunt had any personal opinions except that it was talked about in town," and she reiterated the words she heard. "The two we met in town spoke of it as if there was something more," Hermione says, "something we should be afraid of." "There are many things to be afraid of now that we're in the desert," Amina replies, sighing. "We'll look out for them, but I don't think they're anything more than a myth. The cave is a myth, and here we are blindly running after it. Why should the lights be treated any differently?" Malfoy counters evenly. Hermione looks up at his voice, taken aback, as usual, whenever he speaks. He hasn't said a single word to her today or even glanced her way. She thought that maybe they'd have some things to talk about after the dragon's ride, or at least act cordial enough that there was some potential for a conversation on anything. If it was before, she'd spend the entire morning trying to understand what it was that might have created the distance between them. But she's aware now that whatever his reason is, it won't last, and even if it does stretch out further between them, it'd never be enough of a reason for her. Or at least that's what she tells herself. Hermione narrows her eyes at him, knowing that he's well aware of the direction of her gaze when he clenches his jaw. Amina runs a hand through her raven hair, because we're following Sophia's expedition records, and according to what Hermione said, Sophia didn't see any lights. We treat the lights as important but not a deterrent. I'm not sure what exactly we'll be looking for anyway. Flashes? Rings? We must remain focused on the routes that we've been following thus far to make sure we're not off track. I'm afraid to say we don't have any room for errors if we want to make it back home on time. Everyone gathered murmurs in agreement before dispersing. Amina takes the first book from the stack, turns it to glance at the spine for the title, and hands it to Hermione. It's the book on the basics of runes shown in Sophia's diary, the Spellman's Lexicon on the basics of ancient Egyptian runes. The other books in the stack are extra information on the cave and the pyramid texts. This is kind of exciting, no? Kind of like old times. Amina gapes as Hermione takes out 2 more from her bag. There are 9 books here, Hermione. Hermione frowns, eyeing the collection. It's not enough, is it? We'll never get this done if it's just the 2 of us. Amina eyes skim across the encampment before settling on a figure on the other side of the tent. Draco, come here, please. Hermione glances up from the book in her hand just as Malfoy pauses writing in his journal. Very reluctantly, he rises from where he sits and makes his way over to them. Doing anything important? Amina asks innocently. Malfoy scratches his temple, very much still avoiding looking at Hermione. Not really, but I was about. Amina slams one of the books into his hands. Perfect. Be a darling and help Hermione, will you? We have 9 books to get through and very limited time as it is. He hesitates, but when Amina adds another book to the one in his hands, he stiffly sits down across the table from Hermione. Hermione watches him flip the book open to a random page. His lips thin and the furrow between his brows deepen, but he doesn't look up at her. She runs her tongue across the front of her teeth and returns to the book. Amina settles beside her, reaching for a book on the pyramid text. Hermione scans the page she's on without registering anything. Her mind, for once, is preoccupied with something other than reading. She glances up from the book toward Malfoy. His brows flatten, and though he looks like he's in deep contemplation, she's well aware he isn't. Even with his head bent low over the book, Hermione can see that his eyes remain somewhere in the middle of the page. The same page he's been reading for the past 5 minutes. He exhales through his nose so loudly, an impatient sound that resembles something of a protest against what he's being forced to do, that Amina glances up. Her eyes jump from Malfoy to Hermione before ultimately returning to her book when no one says anything. Hermione sets the book in her hands aside and reaches for Sophia's diary instead. She looks at the contents for exactly 10 seconds before directing her eyes back to Malfoy. Despite trying to convince herself that she's beyond trying to figure Malfoy out, her mind keeps drifting back to him. The redirection of her mind is as instinctive as reaching for a cup of water and not something she can help. Regardless of what she tells herself, the truth is they keep going through substantial moments that have altered her irrevocably, without discussing it afterwards. They move on, pretending as though nothing has happened, and Hermione is itching to sit him down and pick his brain. She then wonders why he won't look at her and why his mood changes like the seasons, expected due to their cyclical nature, but astonishing still when the first leaf of autumn falls or the first bud of spring blooms. Eyes coasting over his face, she wonders if he'd let her cut his hair because the locks near his ears are curling differently from when she'd last inspected them, and she's of the mind that she'd be quite good with clippers once she's read about hair cutting in depth. She wonders also if he thinks about her hair because his entire face is so familiar to her now that it's almost unsettling that she can mirror his expressions or imagine the exact webs of his blonde lashes behind those eyes. Malfoy runs his palm down the page he's supposedly reading and glances sharply up at Hermione. He narrows his eyes accusingly as if to say, "What?" Hermione's eyes widen innocently. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replies. Malfoy sets his jaw. "Stop staring at me." Hermione smirks in response and crosses her arms in defiance. Books all but forgotten now. "You first." He glares at her, then for exactly 5 seconds, before rolling his eyes dramatically as if he can't bother entertaining Hermione's whims today, and returns to his book. She'd take his apparent anger and frustration seriously if she wasn't watching the blush of pale pink spreading across his neck. Hermione grins stupidly, as if she's won something in these passing moments and is about to go back to the diary when she catches Amina staring at her. Amina's brows rise, eyes bouncing from Hermione to Malfoy and back to Hermione before widening into a very pointed and suggestive look. When Amina grins as if to say, I know what's happening and I approve, Hermione's triumphant smile falls and she ducks her head just in time to hide the flush now staining her cheeks. By the time Amina leaves after being called, and Malfoy immediately jumps right after her, and people amble in and out of the tent, and midday has turned into the afternoon, Hermione still hasn't looked up. Later that night, when the fire has turned sparks and the crew has returned to their beds, Hermione stands outside of Malfoy's tent. Arms full of books, she shifts from feet to feet, staring at the gray fabric of the tent and trying to think of a reasonable way to get his attention. He turned into his tent right after dinner, and she'd think he's sleeping if a dimmed light wasn't peeking through the seams. She could call his name, but she'd have to be loud enough for him to hear, and that'd definitely wake up the others. Though she's come to Malfoy for a perfectly rational reason of getting his help on something she's read, Hermione is not too keen on what others might think of her entering his tent this late at night. Maybe she can tap her wand against the tent and it'll create enough of a ripple in the fabric that she could alert him that someone was outside. Or maybe, if she lit her wand, the fluorescent orb of light will be bright enough. The tent opens, and Malfoy steps into the coolness of the night. His eyes drop momentarily to the books before lifting to Hermione's face. He crosses his arms and waits expectantly. There's not a flicker of surprise on his face. I wanted to ask you something, she says, shifting now uncomfortably under his piercing gaze, about something I read. All right. Short, but not exactly dismissive. It's kind of a long question and requires us to go through the books. I'm listening, Granger. Hermione awkwardly readjusts the heavy books, her arms growing numb under her weight. His eyes falls back to the books, and he sighs before opening the tent. He keeps the curtain aside for her, and she ducks under his arm to step inside. It's not what she was expecting, or rather, she didn't know what to expect, because Hermione never thought she'd be in his tent. But the starkness is strange enough that something is missing from her perception of Malfoy. She thought there'd be a lot more green, at least. His gray bed, tightly made except for a single crease where he might have been sitting before, is pushed against one side of the tent. Other than a single chair on the other side of the tent and a stand beside his bed, there's not much else in terms of furniture. His luggage sits beside his bed, and other than 2 books, both of which she recognized him reading before, on his nightstand, it does not look like he's unpacked yet. Another far cry from Hermione's tent. Malfoy follows her inside, the tent sealing shut behind them. He curves around her and makes his way to the bed where he swipes the book resting on it before she can read the title. He stands there, unspeaking, watching her, looking around unabashedly. It's neat, which, yes, of course, she realizes makes sense when she considers how polished he keeps himself at all times, and the fact that it's neater, much neater than her tent is thankfully something he'll never get to see himself. It's dark, too. The only light in the entire tent is a single candle lit beside his books. There's just so much unused space in the tent that she's aching to add something more, a comforter, a rug, or a string of candles so they can at least look at each other properly without squinting. It smells like everything she's come to associate with him, but the honeyed warmth and the scents are contrasted by the perceived coldness of the room. It must reveal something about him, as personal belongings often do about their owner. But everything presented is so clinical and bare that all she can ascertain is that Malfoy is not much for leaving his mark. She glances behind her and sees the shadows of the other tents. Her tent, right across from his, stands further away from behind the fire pit. She whirls back around to glare at him accusingly. You saw me standing outside for 10 whole minutes. It's not a question. He smirks and something inside her loosens at the sight. I'm a man of opportunity, Granger. She rolls her eyes. The air suddenly stills and then becomes awkward as they stare at each other. Malfoy clears his throat. Your question? Right, my question. She looks pointedly away from the bed. Where should I? Malfoy removes the candles and books and transfigures the stand into a table, and he doubles the chairs and arranges everything for them far away from the bed. Hermione sets the books down, settles into the chair, and brings the candle close. It's not really a question, but rather a statement. It takes a few uncertain moments before Malfoy sits down as well. A statement that I hope can open a discussion because, well, as you know, we're running out of time, she rambles, taking out Sophia's diary and digging into her bag. It's imperative I try to figure this out because I know it has something to do with the cave, though maybe it's all just in my head since it's not exactly the forefront of the diary's contents. Granger, he interrupts. His voice for once is gentle and not impatient. What's the statement? I solved the runes. His brows rise at that. Hermione flips to the page the scripts were first found in the diary and flattens it. She takes out the lexicon along with her notes that she scribbled all day in the tent and displays them all out on the table. Malfoy leans in, tilting a parchment in his direction for a closer look. Both of them ignore the jolt that passes between them when his fingers brush against hers. Well, not all of the runes, she corrects. But I did spend all day organizing the different scripts she has in her diary into comprehensible runes by comparing them to the basics found in the lexicon. They resemble a lot like the hieroglyphics found in the pyramid text, except many are combined for words or commands. Commands? Hermione nods. She shows Malfoy the list that she's created. One parchment contains each rune and its associated command, while the other parchment lists all of the runes she pulled together from the diary. The runes are broken down into their very basic derivatives, resembling something akin to the Anglo-Saxon alphabet. Ascend, bind, transform, asunder, all these commands and others are associated with a single rune, while some of the others can be combined to form ritual incantations. But I think we would require the spellbook that Hakim mentioned to organize the runes into the rituals. I suspected an ill-organized spell would be catastrophic considering we're talking about funerary texts. You think she used the runes for the cave. Why else would she have them in her diary? Hermione muses. The first script doesn't start until after the disaster that her crew faced. According to our best estimate, she continued the expedition and found the cave regardless of her missing group. I'm thinking she might have used some of these runes as a way to secure the location, or perhaps help her with tracking the cave once more, since it's suspected she wanted to return. This is what you did today, Malfoy asks, eyes snapping between the notes and the book she used. Hermione frowns. It's not a lot, I know. There are more runes I need to put together, let alone the fact that the basic commands are too juvenile to be considered helpful. She likely used spells from whatever work that she did with the cave, but because we don't have the book, I might miss something. This is mad, he says quietly. The low tenor in his voice reverberates in the quietness of the tent. He lifts his eyes to meet hers. The fact that you did this all day is downright mad, and you're mad for thinking it's enough. Oh. Her voice lowers to a hush. It's a compliment, maybe. Hermione scratches her leg uncomfortably, unsure what to say. Okay. I can help with the rest of the translation, Malfoy offers neutrally. Hermione shakes her head. I can finish the translations. That shouldn't be a problem. I'm more concerned about how to activate the runes. What do you mean? There must be a way to activate them. No, the ancient runes we've studied don't rely on an external source other than the inherent root of magic. Hermione takes out her wand and rope from her bag and severs it in half. Then she uses her wand to spell out the rune for the command embed over the rope, but as predicted, nothing happens. I don't think these runes use magic as an activation, but I've read the books and there's no specific mention of any other requirements. I was thinking it might be helpful if you read the books and try to figure out what I missed. You think I can pick something out that you missed? Perhaps Malfoy's off guard at night, or maybe because they're sitting in his tent, he's more transparent in the environment. Either way, his expressions are far more readable and less strained behind a mask because there's a clear sense of disbelief in his tone that she wouldn't otherwise be privy to. She thinks maybe he's surprised that Hermione would expect him to find something of note if she hasn't already. She's not sure how to deal with this either. Hermione pushes the book toward him. It wouldn't hurt. Malfoy thumbs the side of the books distractedly, the brush of the pages the only other sound in the tent, then the flickering of the candle between them. Malfoy raises his other hand to rake through his hair, a nervous tic of his she's realized, and his eyes fixate on a point on the table. The candle flames turn his still eyes into ashes. For the second time that night, the air switches to something of unease or discomfort at what to do next, and it's not an unfamiliar feeling between them, just something Hermione no longer wants to welcome. He avoids looking at her again, and she suspects that she'd leave on her own volition now that she's done what she came to do, rather than suffer through having him tell her to do so. She wills herself to get up, but she's rooted to her seat. Something is missing, and she's just not ready to end the night. Her eyes roam across the plain tent, settling on nothing before resting on his form once more. Earlier today, she says carefully. Immediately regrets her decision to stay when Malfoy's eyes snap to hers, as if remembering she's still there. When you were talking about the lights, you said something about blindly following a myth. What did you mean? I think it's a myth. Right. What exactly does that mean? Are you asking if I believe the cave to be a myth because it does not exist, or a myth because of its supposed abilities? Both, she states after a second of contemplation. I think the cave exists, but what it claims is a myth. She doesn't like his answer, and the look on his face says that he wasn't expecting her to. What I think shouldn't change what you believe to be true, Granger. Hermione's mouth twists. So you don't believe in enlightenment. I believe in polarities. Life means there is death, and the presence of heat suggests the absence of it. The ability of magic are negated by the lack thereof. If there is darkness, then there must also be light. I don't know if I believe in this concept of a higher power of light that can be received simply by a sip of water. What would enlightenment even look like? I suppose the effects of the water would vary between each person who would drink it. According to my research, it's most similar to the awakening of one's soul, a form of ultimate happiness that isn't a result of material things or the fulfillment of transitory goals like money or power, but rather in the sense of peace, of who and what you are at the moment in time, and the acknowledgement of that being enough. That sounds a lot like the Trelawney shit you hate. Well, no, not really. I don't believe in studying or relying on things that can't be measured directly, like reading tea leaves to see the future, are a lot more preposterous when you consider that the future changes based on our current actions and beliefs. I might be predicted to have come on this trip, but something that I might prioritize more than what I'm looking for on this trip could have come and completely changed the course. Hermione pauses to consider further. I suppose I believe we make our own luck through our actions and choices we make. The cave and its effects, however, are something real and substantial. Through a deliberate act of drinking the water, we see clear consequence, which is enlightenment. I just think that it'd be nice to rise above our past and the actions of our ego and transcend into an individual that is connected to the universe beyond worldly opinions and beliefs. Malfoy looks as if he's resisting rolling his eyes at her. What a lovely sentiment, Granger. There are all those fancy words that don't mean anything substantial in terms of who you might become when you've seen the light. Nothing about rising or awakening is objective and physical enough to be considered anything other than philosophical bullshit. Hermione scowls. You would think that, but it's not necessarily a difficult concept to grasp, Malfoy. Maslow, a Muggle philosopher, believes there is a ladder of needs that one must climb to reach self-actualization, which is the ultimate state that everyone, whether you acknowledge it outright or not, is striving for. Muggles and magical beings are motivated by their need to continue to strive for the next greater thing. Once you've met the basic needs of food, sleep, and shelter, you move on to seeking safety. After that, you look for love and feelings of belonging. Once these stages are met, the next to look for is self-esteem, the perception of worth you have of yourself, and the worth others attach to you. Only when all these stages are met can you reach self-actualization and seek things that give you fulfillment in life. Maybe the cave bypasses all the stages of the ladder and goes straight to self-actualization. What if the fulfillment that I seek in life is gaining power? Hermione blinks, taken aback. Power? Malfoy shrugs. What if the greatest joy in life that I seek is power? Assuming the cave is all-knowing, will I be given power, even if I might use it to distinguish the light in others? Are you seriously looking for power, Malfoy? For some reason, the question leaves a sour taste in her mouth. She spent so much time wondering why he was even searching for the cave that she never considered what he wanted from the cave, or what he was going to do after. Would it be so strange if I was, Granger? Would it not be expected of me? Hermione just stares at him. Surprised by the sudden turn in the conversation, he gazes back at her with a sense of complete ease. His body's relaxed, shoulders light, his hands resting firmly on the table on the books in front of him. But there's a daring gleam in his eyes that seems to challenge her, waits for her to slip or make a mistake. I don't think the purpose of this trip is to drink from the cave, Hermione says diplomatically. It's going to be changed into a historical site protected under international jurisdiction. He looks disappointed by her answer. How would you control the site, like Cahif al-Noor? that has been historically sought by travelers worldwide without power. In this case, power would be used for something good, control and safety of everyone who would like to visit, as well as fair accessibility for all. But you can't let anyone, like myself, drink from it because there would be no control over what I could do from what I gained. Because if I wanted power, then it would be for something evil? No, that's not what I meant, she says, feeling exasperated at her lack of control over the conversation. What you gain from the cave will be motivated by your individual needs. I don't know your personal goals, and as such, there is a level of insecurity and lack of management in that. But through a selected means of leadership and agreed democratically by all, we can control the site for everyone with a strict level of authority and ensure equality between those who would want to visit. Equality, leadership, authority, all words of affirmation you, Gryffindor, sing to go to sleep. Power changes depending on whose hands it's in. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, Malfoy recites, much to Hermione's surprise. He's not supposed to know Muggle philosophy. All those who seek power are seeking it for their own needs and requirements. It doesn't matter if you are of noble intentions or seek power through cunning means. Everyone who wishes to take control over things and people will have to do things that are not necessarily considered good, while others have to do things that may be seen as evil despite their intentions. Hermione glares at him. What do you want me to say, Malfoy? That I think you're evil? That you don't deserve to drink from the cave because of what you believe about yourself? His eyes narrowed dangerously. It's not just what I believe about myself, is it? It's the common perception of the entire world about who's fought on the other side. If there's good, then there is evil. That's what was determined by the end of the war, wasn't it? Everyone collectively sat down and wrote off all those who fought as good or evil, as either deserving a chance at life, like yourself, or getting years spent in Azkaban, like others, like him. Hermione's pulse quickens at the sheer anger in his voice, even though she knows it's not only directed at her. And you think it's as basic as that there are no shades in between, or that you don't have the conscious ability to transition from one polarity to the other? Like I said, Granger, there's either darkness or there is light. And what of evil? Is evil something you are or something you do? There's a spark of recognition at the words he's not supposed to know. You tell me, Granger, what did they tell you in the light? It's not all or nothing, Malfoy. Things can change. How could a room filled with darkness change physically and molecularly into light? She doesn't understand what he wants to hear from her, or what conclusions he wants her to draw about him or herself. Maybe he wants to trap her into admitting that her opinion of him is the collective opinion of others, that he deserved to rot in Azkaban because he was so inherently evil and dangerous that he needed to be locked away from the public sight. And perhaps the end goal of that is to make Hermione feel ashamed of her beliefs and her sense of self-righteousness. But she also knows it's not as vindictive as that. She can sense it in the way he's leaned in closer and the way his hands have turned into white-knuckled fists, like that in his exact moment, whether he consciously knows it or not, he needs her. He needs her to defy the beliefs the world may have of him, even if it's a lie. I can bring in a candle. Now there's light in a room of darkness. But that is introducing something completely new that at its core, in its chemical composition, is different from the darkness itself, Malfoy counters. But life is not about walking in complete blindness of the dark or the blinding brightness of the light, she says. Whether we want it or not, everything and everyone is influenced by each other. I can live a life in the light, but someone can take the light source away and put me in the dark. Or I can add light into my life of darkness so that there is sight. There's a clearer way, a path that I can follow now that I can see. I think sometimes we learn to live life of familiarity and comfort in the dark because it's frightening to turn on the light and see all the monsters hidden in the corners. But the choice to bring in a candle of whatever size is still there as long as we live and as long as the darkness remains. Palpable seconds of stiffening silence pass between them, and the mask that he's cast aside at the start of their evening together gives Hermione access to all the emotions in his eyes. Malfoy struggles between stubbornness and frustration, and it looks like he might say something cruel or harsh, but there is a brief flash of hope that ultimately settles into resignation. If only everyone lived to your idealistic world of peace and light, Granger. He smirks bitterly, because this is easier for him to do than ever admitting out loud what he feels. But I guess it's a lot easier to think this way if you're given an order of Merlin for it. Hermione flinches so physically at his words that Malfoy's smirk falters. It's not the worst thing he's ever said to her, but it still hurts enough that a lump grows in her throat, making it difficult for her to breathe. She shouldn't be this surprised, but somewhere in the stupid workings of her head, she thought maybe now that he'd seen her, he'd realize that nothing in her life was just easy. To even hope was one of the most difficult things Hermione can do. To discredit her beliefs and her way of thinking as a means of gaining materialistic things is less painful than him pretending the things that have happened between them so far on the trip are meaningless. She wants him to value their shared sacred moments, moments that are undeniably sacred to her, rather than continue to perpetuate the false and fickle opinions and perceptions they've been forced to believe. Silently, Hermione starts packing and mindlessly throws everything into her bag. Her chest constricts and she's tempted to rub her hand against it to ease the discomfort, but she also refuses to sit in this tent any longer. She's aware that he's watching her. She moves around the table and hopes, foolishly, that he might say something, anything, to claw at the new wound he's cut. When it's clear that he won't say anything, she makes way to leave. Granger. Hermione stops with her back to him. She doesn't move. A sound, something low, in between impatient sigh or frustrated growl, escapes him. Granger, look at me. Hermione shuts her eyes and clenches her teeth. She wants to yell at him for having the nerve to command her still, and she contemplates leaving him like this to make a point that she's completely depleted by him. Instead, she sighs and turns to face him. His expression is unreadable. Half of his face is shrouded in the darkness. Nothing's changed, he says plainly. Disappointment replaces some of the hurt in her chest. She stares and stares at him, waiting for him to explain what he means or take back his words from before. You say that, and I think it's your greatest lie yet, she says finally. I've seen you, Malfoy, and that just terrifies you, doesn't it? There's a flash of angry silver in the darkness as Malfoy leans forward into the light. Maybe she should be terrified of the look in his eyes, but her own frustration gains weight at that moment, and Hermione turns back around and steps into the night. Later in bed, Hermione lies awake, much to her annoyance despite the potions, and thinks about Malfoy. She doesn't want to think about Malfoy, and if there's a potion that could wipe out any thoughts or memories of him, she would take it greedily. She's angry and upset, and she wants to remain this way until Malfoy feels uncomfortable and misses her absence and comes to her to make amends. For once, she wants someone to come to her. But of course, what she wants will never happen, and she's left ruminating about something he said in the heat of their argument. Others will have to do things that may be seen as evil despite their intentions. She doesn't think he noticed what he said to her, and she knows if he was less flustered and less keen on making Hermione slip, he never would have said it in the first place. But the words are a clear reference to his Wizengamot trials. She knows this because she was there, listening to every word said, every day for 9 days of his trial, until the 10th day that was specially arranged on her request for a private testimony. Intent. That's what it all came down to, because at the end of the day, the evidence showed Malfoy, despite his apparent allegiance to Voldemort, despite the mark on his arm, had never killed anyone. Several runs of defense and battle spells were imprinted in his wand and thus not disputed. Other dangerous spells that the Ministry had never seen before and were suspected to be created by Voldemort were also found in his wand. There was no doubt that Malfoy had fought hard in the war, and through his hands he had hurt many in unthinkable and unconscientious ways. But not once did he utter an unforgivable, not once did he use the killing curse. If Hermione hadn't already resolved to testify on his behalf, this knowledge alone would have convinced her, because Hermione had seen almost every Order member kill someone. Harry, Ron, Lupin, the names were endless and could have included hers as well if she had ever found herself in the position to do so. There are people who she would have killed for. Eyes open and unflinching. They killed and killed and killed, and each murder was justified in the eye of the court, the mind of the world, because of their intention behind the act. The means justified the end simply because it was easier to convince everyone they had to do it for the greater good. They had to kill when the other side was thinking of genocide and mass executions. Because, can't you see? They'll kill us first if we don't kill them. Don't you just see the hatred on their face? That's what will kill us, their hate. And maybe they were to suffer for the rest of their lives for the perversion of their souls with each utterance of the curse, but not one person on their side was tried for a war crime. When it came to Malfoy, Azkaban was definite, but the question of how long was debated. Apparently, there was a correct number of years for practicing dark magic and aligning oneself with Voldemort, and the entire Wizengamot was hell-bent on figuring it out. They argued viciously, tore his name apart ruthlessly, crushed him and his decisions and choices until he was nothing, and Malfoy was made to witness it all. "He was a child," said the witch sitting beside the Minister of Magic. "The time should be reduced." "More children were fighting against Voldemort than there were fighting with him," argued another member of the Wizengamot. "What of those children? At least 15 years in Azkaban." 10 years, countered a wizard. "Life," said another. "The kiss," whispered a voice, and the entire chamber was silenced. In the shadows, Hermione gasped. In the center of the room, Malfoy, who had not uttered a single word or even exhaled a breath too loud, just blinked. What was it about him, Hermione wondered, that made them so angry? Was it his name? Was this one chance for the wizarding world to finally get back at the remaining heir of the lives that were lived without the consequences of the Malfoys before? It was brutal, and Hermione didn't understand why. "He raised the wand," Harry testified. "I saw him raise the wand, but he didn't kill Dumbledore. Severus Snape did." And therein lay the dilemma. Would he have killed Dumbledore if Snape hadn't stepped in? Would Malfoy have eventually cast the killing curse if given enough time in the war? If given enough reason to? Did it matter that he was coerced as a child by guardians that were supposed to protect and save him? Did it matter what thoughts were thrashing Malfoy's mind when he raised the wand? Were fears and hesitation sufficient enough in the court of law to back the claim that Malfoy didn't want to kill Dumbledore? That he did not have the state of mind to kill? Did anyone care at all what he had to see or suffer? The answer, however, was that Malfoy could kill, and so he was a killer. Perhaps it was Harry's testimony of what happened in the tower and the night at the Malfoy Manor that ultimately removed the kiss from the table. And maybe it was Hermione's recall of the time of that same night and what she believed she saw Malfoy do for her, specifically, that reduced the length of his sentence. Either way, Hermione realizes Malfoy's right. Nothing's changed. Malfoy went to Azkaban, and his name was buried deep, deep under the dirt. Nothing changed because the world simply did not care for his intentions or the reasons why he did what he had to do. They hated him with an intensity that would have put the Death Eaters to shame. He was cursed for the very lack of the choices he had. In the end, not a single thing changed at all. The wand was raised, and Malfoy's life was damned forever. Whew, this was a long one, and it was good. So see you in the next one.